The coffeehouse had the kind of quiet that felt heavier than silence. The hum of an old refrigerator in the corner, the soft clink of a spoon against porcelain, the muted jazz track looping faintly from a dusty speaker above the door. Outside, Denver's winter pressed against the glass, gray sky spilling over streets that looked half asleep themselves. Megan Parker moved between tables with practiced ease, though her mind wandered elsewhere. She had been working double shifts for weeks, the rent looming in her head louder than any music. Her younger brother's medical bills sat folded in her purse, unread tonight, but not forgotten. She poured coffee for the man with the laptop, wiped crumbs from the counter, smiled when she didn't feel like smiling. That was her rhythm. Serve, clean, repeat. She almost didn't notice them at first. Just another customer and his kid, she thought, until something in the stillness of that corner made her look twice. The girl sat so quietly she might have been carved from porcelain, small hands folded in her lap, legs dangling above the floor, her gaze locked on the cafe window where condensation blurred the outside world. She didn't touch the paper cup of milk cooling beside her. Her shoulders were tense, stiff in a way children rarely were. Beside her, the man leaned forward, rummaging in his wallet with clumsy fingers. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened like he had given up halfway through the day. There was exhaustion on his face, not just the kind from a long shift, but the kind that seeped from somewhere deeper. Sorry, he muttered to the barista, pushing a card across the counter. This one should work. His voice was polite, but his hands shook slightly. Megan watched the scene play out, her towel still in her hand. Something about the girl's stillness unsettled her. Children fidgeted, laughed, tugged at sleeves. But this one, she seemed folded into herself, unreachable. When the transaction finally went through, the man exhaled in quiet relief, murmured thanks, and returned to the table. He set the receipt aside, tapped the girl's shoulder gently. No reaction. She didn't blink, didn't turn, didn't give the slightest sign she had heard him. Megan felt the tug again, that instinct she usually ignored, the one that made her cross lines she told herself weren't hers to cross. But tonight, it was stronger. She took a slow step toward them, then another. She crouched beside the chair, apron brushing the wooden floor, her voice dropping into something soft. "Hi there," she said, smiling gently. "Would you like a refill on your milk?" The girl didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the fogged window, as if Megan's words had dissolved before reaching her. Megan hesitated. Then, after a breath, she lifted her hands. She hadn't used sign language in months, not since the community center cut its program, but the shapes came back like muscle memory. "Hello?" She signed slowly. "My name is Megan." At first, nothing. The man frowned slightly, watching, confusion flickering in his eyes. And then, the smallest shift. The girl blinked, her gaze snapping away from the window to Megan's hands. Her fingers trembled, uncertain, before she raised them. Awkward, hesitant shapes formed. "Hello." The cafe seemed to pause. Even the hiss of the espresso machine felt quieter, as though the whole room was holding its breath. The man's head turned sharply toward his daughter. His eyes widened, and for a moment the weariness broke open into something raw. Relief, astonishment, grief all tangled into one. His lips parted, but no words came out. Megan's throat tightened. She smiled again, softer this time, her own hands moving carefully. "What's your name?" The girl's small fingers answered with a shy, deliberate motion. "Emily." And then, almost like sunlight through a crack, a smile flickered on her lips. Small, fragile, but real. The father pressed a hand to his mouth, his shoulders shaking once as if he had been holding his breath for months. Megan stayed kneeling on the floor, heart pounding. She hadn't expected anything more than a polite nod, maybe silence. But this was different. A moment heavier than the ordinary air around them. Emily looked at her again, eyes no longer empty but bright with recognition. And in that quiet corner of a small-town cafe, something shifted. For the girl, for the man, and for Megan herself. The cafe had mostly emptied by the time the little girl finished her sandwich. The dinner crowd had thinned into scattered shadows. A pair of students with laptops, an older couple lingering over pie. Megan wiped down the counter with automatic movements, but her eyes kept drifting to the corner table where the man and his daughter sat. They hadn't spoken much. The father, Jason, though she didn't yet know his name, kept stealing glances at the girl, searching for signs she was still there, still present. And Emily, as Megan had learned, responded only in silence, her hands sometimes twitching toward her cup before retreating again. Megan brought them grilled cheese and coffee, sliding the plate gently across the table. "On the house," she said, ignoring the man's protest. "We make a decent sandwich." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." His voice carried a weight that made even simple words sound fragile. Megan didn't linger. She returned to her station, though she kept glancing back. She saw the way he broke the sandwich into smaller pieces for the girl, setting them in front of her like offerings. She saw the way Emily nibbled, cautious at first, then with more certainty. She even caught the faintest curve of a smile when he poured her milk into the saucer, and she giggled, silent but unmistakable. For some reason, that tiny smile struck Megan harder than it should have. She pressed her hand to the counter to steady herself. By the time they rose to leave, the cafe felt quieter, emptier somehow. The man gathered their things with slow movements, careful not to rush his daughter. He gave Megan a small nod at the door. She nodded back, though something in her chest resisted letting them go. The bell jingled once, and then they were gone, swallowed into the night air. Megan exhaled, the kind of exhale that carried more than breath. She wiped down another table, stacked mugs, reset napkin holders. She tried to shake it off, but the image of Emily's hands moving in hesitant signs replayed in her mind, over and over. When she reached their table, she stopped. Beneath the coffee cup, tucked neatly into the saucer, lay a folded napkin. Not crumpled like most, not stained. Perfectly square, edges aligned as though placed there with care. Megan frowned, lifted it carefully. Something about the weight felt wrong, heavier than paper should be. She unfolded it with fingers that trembled more than she'd like to admit. In dark, steady handwriting, the words sprawled across the fabric. Thank you for giving her a reason to smile. That was all. No name, no number, just a quiet line written in ink that seemed to carry more truth than entire conversations. Megan pressed the napkin to her chest. For reasons she couldn't explain, her eyes stung. She wasn't the one who should be moved. She was just a waitress who had knelt on the floor and signed a simple word. And yet, something about the note clung to her, as though it belonged not just to them but to her as well. She carried the napkin to the counter and set it beside the register. But even as she poured another pot of coffee, her gaze returned to it, over and over. The folded edges, the steady script. Later, when the cafe lights dimmed and chairs were stacked, Megan lingered at the door longer than usual. Outside, the streets were slick with melted snow, neon reflecting in puddles. She hugged her coat tighter, but the cold didn't explain the ache in her chest. Back at her small apartment, she set the napkin on her bedside table. She tried to distract herself with bills, with the endless list of things undone. But her eyes found it again. She touched the edge, her thumb brushing the ink. Why did it feel like more than paper? Why did she care so much about a man whose name she didn't even know? She lay awake long into the night, the city's silence pressing through the thin walls. Somewhere between half-dream and wakefulness, she thought she could still see Emily's smile. Fragile, fleeting, but real. And for the first time in weeks, Megan allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something small but extraordinary. The morning rush had already begun when Megan tied her apron behind her back. The cafe was warmer than the street outside, alive with the usual chaos of coffee orders shouted over the hiss of steam, the smell of cinnamon rolls mixing with roasted beans. She balanced 2 mugs on a tray, weaving between tables, smiling in that automatic way she had trained herself to, a smile that rarely reached her eyes. And then, as if the room shifted, she saw them. The bell above the door jingled, and there they were, the quiet man and his daughter. But this time was different. Emily wasn't frozen in her chair, staring through the glass. She wasn't silent and still. She burst inside with a suddenness that startled Megan, her curls bouncing as she ran straight toward her. "Megan!" The voice was small but clear, and it stopped the cafe cold. A few heads turned, curious, but Megan barely noticed. She crouched down instinctively, arms half open, and Emily collided against her with the unreserved trust only children carried. Megan blinked hard, pulling back just enough to look at her. Emily's face was flushed with excitement, her hands signing quickly, clumsy but certain. "I wanted to see you." Megan's throat tightened. She answered in kind, fingers shaping the response. "I'm glad you came back." Behind them, Jason stood in the doorway, watching. His shirt was pressed today, though the exhaustion still lingered in his posture. For the first time, however, there was something else in his expression. A cautious relief, like the weight of last night's silence had lifted, if only slightly. Megan led Emily to their usual corner, already knowing what to bring. Without asking, she filled a glass with strawberry milk, setting it gently in front of the girl. Emily's eyes lit up, and she signed thank you with such deliberate care that Megan almost laughed through the ache in her chest. Jason slid into the opposite chair, his movements slower, measured. For a long moment he said nothing, only watched his daughter sip happily. Then, as if gathering courage, he looked up at Megan. "I didn't get to introduce myself yesterday," he said, his voice low. "Jason Miller. And this is Emily, though you already figured that out." Megan smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Megan." Jason nodded once, almost shyly, before glancing at his daughter again. "We're taking a break. From Seattle." He didn't elaborate, and Megan didn't press. There was a finality in the way he said it, like a door closed behind him. They talked little after that. Megan refilled coffees, brought plates, tended to other tables. But every time she passed their corner, Emily looked up with that same expectant joy, and Megan couldn't help but stop, kneeling to sign a word, to laugh at a scribbled drawing, to let the little girl's hands guide her through an invented story. It wasn't until after they left that Megan noticed the notebook. It lay half-hidden beneath the sugar caddy, its cover plain, corners worn. She picked it up, meaning to set it aside for lost and found. But curiosity slowed her fingers. She flipped it open. The pages were filled with drawings. Rough sketches, lines uneven, words scribbled in the margins. But the subject was unmistakable: hand shapes, the alphabet, simple signs like yes, no, love, safe. Each one traced again and again, sometimes shaky, sometimes strong, as though someone had been teaching themselves late into the night. Megan's breath caught. She turned more pages, her chest tightening with each clumsy attempt at the language. This wasn't just a father trying to manage. This was a man clawing his way into his daughter's silent world, teaching himself a new tongue so she wouldn't have to live without a voice. Her hands trembled as she closed the notebook. She pressed it against her chest, the same way she had pressed the napkin the night before. But this felt different. He wasn't just surviving. He was trying with everything he had left. The bell above the door jingled again as new customers entered, and Megan slipped the notebook behind the counter for safekeeping. But her mind wasn't on the orders or the coffee or the bills waiting at home. It was on Jason and Emily, on the sketch of a sign for safe, drawn again and again until the page nearly tore. She didn't know their story. Not yet. But she felt its gravity pulling her closer. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she wanted to stay. The motel smelled faintly of bleach, the kind that never masked the dampness creeping through the carpet. A single bulb flickered above the narrow walkway, buzzing against the night. Jason pushed the door open with his shoulder, carrying Emily, who had fallen asleep on the ride back, her arms slack around his neck. The room was small. 2 beds with thin quilts, a table scarred by cigarette burns, curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle. But it was warm, and warmth was enough for now. Jason laid Emily gently on the nearest bed, brushing a curl from her cheek. She stirred, mumbling something only half-formed, before settling back into sleep. He stood there for a long moment, watching her chest rise and fall, as though reassurance lived in every breath she took. When she was finally still, he lowered himself onto the other bed. The springs creaked under his weight. He pressed his hands over his face and exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that scraped the inside of his chest raw. He used to sleep in hotel suites where the sheets smelled of starch and the windows overlooked entire cities. Once, not long ago, he was the man shaking hands across boardroom tables, making decisions that sent headlines spinning. Jason Miller, founder, innovator, tech visionary. Words that looked sharp in print but felt hollow now. The divorce had been brutal. Lawyers circling like vultures, colleagues whispering, investors doubting. But none of it compared to the silence that followed when Emily's mother walked out. The slammed door, the absence that echoed louder than any argument. Emily had not spoken a word since. Jason had tried everything, specialists, therapies, schools that promised miracles. But Emily's silence had become part of their life, heavy and immovable. Until yesterday, until a waitress in a small café signed a simple hello, and something inside his daughter lit up again. He thought of Megan's hands, patient and careful. The way Emily had smiled, however briefly. The napkin he had left behind felt inadequate, but he hadn't known what else to give. Gratitude was not enough, but it was all he had. Jason leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. On the table sat the notebook, his clumsy sketches of signs, pages crumpled from use. He opened it again, tracing the shapes with his fingertip. Safe. Home. Dad. Words he wanted Emily to know, to trust. Words he feared she might forget. A sharp knock startled him. His heart jumped, then sank. But it was only the motel manager, sliding the bill beneath the door. Another reminder. Another cost he couldn't outrun forever. Jason picked it up, scanning the numbers. His savings had thinned to threads. Most of what remained went to lawyers. Her lawyers, the ones determined to strip him of the only thing that still mattered. He could fight. He would fight. But every battle drained him further. He glanced back at Emily, curled beneath the quilt, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. She looked smaller than she was, fragile in a way that tore at him. The thought of losing her, of her being taken by people who hadn't been there when she cried through the night, when she refused food, when silence pressed down like a weight, made his chest tighten until breathing hurt. He pressed a hand to the wall, steadying himself. He could give up the company, the house, the headlines. He already had. But he could not give up Emily. The motel's clock ticked unevenly, marking hours he couldn't afford to waste. He sat back on the bed, notebook still open, pen in hand. He drew again, shaky lines forming the word family. His eyes blurred, but he kept going, filling the page with the only thing he still believed in. Outside, cars hissed along the wet highway. Inside, a father clung to the last scraps of his world. A daughter's breathing, a notebook of broken signs, and a hope he wasn't sure he deserved. In the dim motel room, Jason whispered to no one, "I won't let them take you." Emily stirred, her small hand reaching blindly across the quilt. Jason was there in an instant, holding it gently. Her fingers curled around his like an anchor, pulling him back from the edge. He sat that way for the rest of the night, hand in hand with his daughter, staring at the darkness, vowing to fight even when the weight of everything threatened to break him. The cafe was alive with its usual chorus, the hiss of milk steaming, the clatter of mugs, the scrape of chairs against old wooden floors. But for Megan, the noise blurred at the edges. Her eyes kept returning to the corner table, where Emily sat with crayons scattered across the surface like bright little fragments of order in a messy world. Emily's small hands moved quickly now, less hesitant than before. She had drawn a house, crooked but sturdy, and beneath it a stick figure holding the hand of a smaller one. Megan crouched beside her, watching. "What's this?" she signed, pointing to the taller figure. "Dad," Emily signed back with certainty. Then her fingers shifted clumsily, forming another shape, U. Megan's breath caught. She laughed softly to cover it, but her chest ached in the gentlest way. "Me?" she whispered. Emily nodded, beaming, her curls bouncing. Jason sat across from them, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. He didn't interrupt. He watched. His gaze steady, quiet, filled with something that was equal parts gratitude and fear. Every time Emily laughed, Every time her hands shaped words, his shoulders lifted a fraction, as though he were inhaling air he hadn't breathed in years. Megan taught Emily new signs between customers. Happy, light, friend. The girl absorbed them hungrily, fingers stumbling but determined. When she finally managed to sign laugh correctly, she burst into giggles, tipping sideways into Megan's lap. The sound was small, imperfect, and it filled the cafe like sunlight breaking through clouds. A few patrons turned, surprised, then smiled. Jason lowered his head, covering his mouth with his hand. His eyes shimmered, though he said nothing. Later, when Megan returned to the counter, her coworker nudged her. "You've got away with kids," she said lightly, but there was something curious in her tone. Megan only smiled faintly and poured another cup of coffee. If she said more, her voice might betray how much it mattered. Outside of work, her life pressed on with the same heaviness. Bills stacked on the kitchen counter. Her younger brother, Danny, needed another round of medication the insurance wouldn't cover. She stretched tips until they broke, worked doubles until her body ached. But every time Emily ran into the cafe with her awkward, beautiful signs, the weight lifted, if only for an hour. One evening, after closing, Megan found Jason still lingering at the corner table. Emily had fallen asleep against his arm. Her drawings spread across the table in a patchwork of colors. "You don't have to stay," Megan said softly, wiping down the counter. Jason shook his head. "She doesn't fall asleep like this often. I didn't want to wake her." Megan hesitated, then walked closer. "She's incredible. You know that, right?" His jaw tightened, as though holding back more than words. "She used to be louder than anyone, couldn't stop talking. After her mother left," he trailed off, staring at the drawings. Silence became safer for her. Megan sat across from him, lowering her voice. "And for you." Jason looked at her then, really looked. His eyes were raw, tired, but open. "For me?" Silence became the only thing I could manage. The words hung between them, heavy but honest. Megan wanted to reach across the table, to take his hand the way she took Emily's when teaching her a new sign. Instead, she said softly, "She's finding her voice again. You both are." For the first time since she'd met him, Jason smiled, small, uncertain, but real. When he gathered Emily into his arms to leave, Megan slipped one of the girl's drawings back into her own pocket. She didn't know why. Maybe to remind herself that joy was still possible, even when everything else felt impossible. That night, in her cramped apartment with its peeling paint and buzzing radiator, Megan pinned the drawing above her desk. Two stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun. One labeled Dad, the other labeled M. She stared at it for a long time, the quiet hum of the city outside her window. Somewhere in the silence, she realized she was no longer just helping a little girl. She was becoming part of their world, and part of her wanted to stay there. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the kind of place where silence carried weight. Jason sat at the long oak table, his tie pulled tight against his throat. His hands were clasped together, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. On the other side of the aisle, sleek lawyers in sharp suits whispered to one another, their briefcases gleaming, their confidence unshaken. Emily sat between them, small and pale in her dress, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. She hadn't let go of it since morning. Her eyes darted around the cavernous room, wide and frightened. Jason bent down, trying to smile, but his voice caught in his throat. Then Megan entered. She had taken the morning off despite the cost. The cafe would manage without her, but Jason and Emily could not. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her hands clutching a notepad. She caught Jason's eye as she slipped into the seat beside him. His shoulders dropped, just slightly, like her presence loosened a weight he couldn't shake alone. The proceedings began with formalities. The opposing lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "Emily deserves stability. Mr. Miller has abandoned his career, his resources. The child's welfare would be best served with her mother." Jason flinched but said nothing. His own lawyer whispered strategy, but the words felt thin, breakable. Emily shrank into her chair, pressing her rabbit to her face. Megan reached for her hand, squeezing gently. Then, without hesitation, she signed, "Safe. You are safe." Emily looked up, eyes wide. Her breathing slowed. For the first time since entering the room, she nodded. When the judge called for testimony, Jason rose. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke of nights in motels, of giving up boardrooms for bedtime stories, of learning sign language by lamplight so his daughter would never feel alone in her silence. His words were not polished, but they were raw, real. The opposing lawyer pressed hard. "Mr. Miller, would you agree you've made choices that jeopardize your daughter's security? Walking away from wealth, from stability, from a company that could have provided everything." Jason's jaw clenched. Everything except love. The room shifted at that. Even the judge leaned back slightly, her gaze sharpening. Then Emily was called. The courtroom seemed to freeze. Jason's breath caught, panic flickering across his face. Emily clutched Megan's arm, refusing to move. "It's okay," Megan whispered, bending down. "I'll come with you." Together they approached the stand. Emily climbed onto the chair, her feet dangling. The bailiff looked uncertain. "She doesn't. She signs," Megan interrupted gently. "I can interpret." The judge considered, then nodded. "Proceed." Megan knelt beside Emily, her heart pounding. Slowly, carefully, she asked the questions in sign. Emily's small hands answered, hesitant at first, then with more certainty. "Do you feel safe with your father?" Emily's fingers moved. "Yes." "Why?" Her answer came slowly. Then she looked directly at the judge. "Because he stays. Because he learns my words." The courtroom was utterly silent. Megan hesitated, then signed one last question. One she hadn't been asked to translate, but felt in her bones. "Who do you feel safe with?" Emily swallowed, her eyes wet, then lifted her hands. "Dad and Megan." Megan froze, her breath catching. She hadn't expected it. But Emily wasn't finished. She lowered her hands, leaned forward, and whispered. A sound so small it barely carried, but clear enough. "Dad." The room stilled as if the air itself had been cut. Jason's head dropped into his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp but not harsh. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Custody remains with Mr. Miller. Permanently." The mother's lawyers sputtered protests, but the decision had been made. What mattered wasn't wealth or influence, but the unmistakable truth of a child's voice. Her first word in months, spoken not to lawyers or judges, but to the man who never stopped fighting for her. When the gavel fell a final time, Megan took Emily into her arms. The little girl buried her face against Megan's shoulder, trembling but smiling through her tears. Jason reached for them both, his hand brushing Megan's as if anchoring himself to the only thing that mattered. In that courtroom heavy with rules and records, something unmeasurable had won. Love spoken at last. Weeks passed. Winter loosened its grip, and the first hints of spring crept into Denver. Wet sidewalks, bare trees whispering with small buds, the smell of thaw in the air. Megan still worked her shifts at the café, still counted tips into neat piles at night, still worried over rent and medical bills. Yet something in her rhythm had changed. Every morning she caught herself glancing toward the door, waiting for it to open with a familiar jingle. And most mornings it did. Emily was no longer the silent, still child who once clutched her father's sleeve. She burst into the café with drawings tucked under her arm, her hands flying with new signs Megan had taught her. Sometimes she laughed so loudly that customers looked up from their laptops, startled, only to smile when they saw her joy. Jason came too, quieter, always hovering a step behind, his gaze softening each time Emily tugged Megan toward their usual corner. He rarely spoke much, but the unspoken was there, in the way his eyes lingered, in the way he seemed to exhale whenever Megan knelt beside Emily as though she belonged there. One afternoon, when the café was nearly empty, Jason waited until Emily dashed to the counter to show Megan her latest drawing. He cleared his throat, his voice low. "I owe you the truth," he said. Megan turned, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "I'm not just a father struggling to get by," he continued. "I am the CEO of a company in Seattle. I walked away from it all. The money, the press, the boardrooms. None of it mattered after the divorce. After she stopped speaking." He nodded toward Emily, his voice roughening. "All I wanted was to keep her safe." Megan blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. She tried to picture him in polished suits, shaking hands across glass tables, and failed. The man before her was tired, human, carrying more scars than power. "I don't care about that," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "I care about her. And you." Jason looked at her then, really looked, as if searching for doubt, but he found none. Weeks later, they met at the park. The sky was wide and blue, children's laughter carrying across the grass. Emily ran ahead, curls bouncing, her rabbit tucked under one arm. She stopped suddenly, turned back, and signed clumsily, then whispered a single word, her voice uneven but brave. "Mom." Megan froze, her heart stumbling. Jason's breath caught too, his eyes wet before he could hide it. He crouched beside Emily, pulling her close, but his gaze never left Megan's. The word lingered in the air, fragile and new, but filled with a kind of truth that no courtroom or contract could measure. Jason whispered, his voice breaking, "We're finally a family." Megan knelt beside them, her hands trembling as she reached for Emily's. The little girl squeezed tightly, her smile wide enough to break the last shadows of winter. And in that quiet park, beneath a sky just beginning to change seasons, Megan felt it. Not an ending, but a beginning. A family not chosen by blood, but by love.